It's always a bit interesting talking about my all-time favorite pieces of media because in a lot of cases, it's not what you would expect. I think a lot of people feel that a lot of writers are really attached to artsy, high-end works, stuff from these really well-regarded, critically acclaimed writers. But in actuality, one of my all-time favorite pieces of media are silly newspaper comic strips. And it really does need to be said more, like across all industries, that critical reception doesn't really mean a whole lot. For me, a piece of media having a piece of media needs to have some kind of personal, just kind of draw to it. Something that makes it appealing to me as an individual. To me, that's what makes it great. And every time I go back to Calvin and Hobbes, ever since I first discovered it when I was 8 years old, it really does strike me just how cutting edge, innovative, creative, and fun this series actually is. And coming back to it as an adult, not even for the first time, but for the most recent time coming back to it, like it dawns on me more and more just how top tier this series actually is, because like all pieces of ageless media, timeless stuff, you keep gaining more and more appreciation for it. You keep learning more and more about the characters, like the artistry. You keep developing new perspectives. It reminds me a lot in that way of No More Heroes, where it feels like as I get older, I come away with new and different perspectives of it. With Calvin and Hobbes, I feel like this is the first time I've come back to it as like an established adult, making my own money and having my own perspective and my own like childhood nostalgia instead of just still living through it. Like coming back to it this most recent time has been enlightening because it's the first time I've read this where I feel as if I relate more to the adults than the child characters. So as an adult, you do relate a lot more to the ideas that, the adult characters don't like Calvin. They think he's annoying. They think he's scum. And as a result of that, you really get this new perspective that you don't really have as a kid. Because if you're a kid reading Calvin and Hobbes, doubtless, you relate to Calvin as a character. When I first read this, I found Calvin to be super, super relatable. I saw myself a lot in him. I had the same kind of personality type and like the worldview and like the behavior. And just looking at the character, it was very interesting kind of finding something that kind of correlated to my own situation, because my situation was a lot like Calvin's, in the sense where like there was no one around, nobody wants to hang out with you, you just kind of sit around doing nothing, just lost in your own thoughts, being like so imaginative and coming up with all these crazy situations. It was very, very relatable to me at the time. And eventually I would read these comics so much that I would start developing a kind of warped perspective on them. Like I would relate to Calvin so much, I would start comparing myself to him and start being very insecure, because Calvin has this very extensive vocabulary. Calvin does this thing where he starts rambling about politics, about philosophy, about the world, about his views on it, and being a bit older than Calvin when I first started reading this, like, it really made me feel insecure, as if I was, like, dumber than Calvin. A kid that, as presented in the comic, was very, very dumb. Someone who constantly failed at school, constantly, like, failed to resolve his personal problems, constantly had problems with his parents. It was very shocking kind of reading this as a kid and kind of developing this, like, insecurity that you are coming in second to a 6-year-old. That a 6-year-old who's failing out of class is somehow smarter than you. But, reading it as an adult, you get more and more of a sense of the nuances of it. The idea that Calvin isn't dumb, he's actually very intelligent. He's just the sort of person who doesn't do well in the school environment. Calvin isn't an idiot. He's actually very smart, but because his teachers and his parents don't cultivate his skill set properly, that they don't set him on the right path to like take advantage of his interests, like he comes off as this very disjointed, like unhinged kid, instead of like utilizing his vast knowledge, very obvious vast knowledge of, of space, of dinosaurs, of like history, philosophy, culture. Like, instead he's like kind of looked down on and mocked for things that are pretty petty and ridiculous. Like, oh no, he said something weird to me. Like it really comes across as if like Calvin is some kind of genius savant that his parents like just don't know what to do with. Like, they don't understand that their child is actually very talented in very certain degree, in very specific ways. The idea that you're dumb because you're failing out of school is wrong, essentially. Like, if you're applying yourself in any specific field, if you're gaining knowledge, if you're like improving yourself and like following your passions, like, you're not dumb. Okay, like, and it's very interesting coming back to this as an adult and like reading this, because you have this mindset that like Calvin is just someone who is completely alone and isolated because nobody around him really understands him or really takes the time to understand him. His parents, like, all they do is seethe about how difficult he is to deal with. His teachers get upset at him for zoning out. Like, he has one friend, Susie, and, his best friend is a stuffed animal. The best friend that this guy can come up with, who can actually have back and forth conversations with him, who can actually, like, discuss, like, his worldview and his ideas and, like, what he cares about. The only person who will listen to him about anything important is his own imagination, like his own stuffed animal. And by the way, like, I know there's a big debate about like whether or not Hobbes is real. Reading the entire thing, it's pretty apparent that he isn't. It's like, I don't know why there was such a debate about it. I think as a kid I really like went back and forth on this, but yeah, I think reading it as an adult, it's very clear that Hobbes is not real. Which is interesting, because as a kid I always felt that it was more ambiguous, that the series had light fantasy elements, but like reading it as an adult, it feels very, very grounded. It feels very, very much in place of like things that can actually happen for the most part, or things that can happen in your imagination. I think is the important thing to emphasize about this series. Fantastical elements, because nothing all that weird happens like around the adults. Like, it's such a weird contrast whenever it's just Calvin and Hobbes like screwing around in the woods versus him dealing with his parents. Like, you can tell that it's all like just in his imagination. Like, this is like his comfort zone, because he has nothing else. Like, that's the reality of Calvin's, like, the tragedy of the character. And it's really odd for something that has a reputation for being such this whimsical, lighthearted series. I see it as being kind of bleak in that sense, where Calvin is this, like, kid with all this potential, all these things he can do, all these things he knows, and yet, like, no one around him cares. All anybody cares about is what he can do for them, or considering he's so young, how much of a burden of it he is, how much of an inconvenience. Like, we can't have other kids because they're gonna turn out like Calvin. It's sad reading this. It's kind of depressing in that sense, because putting myself back in that situation, looking at it through that lens and thinking about like what things were like back then. You just have like these endless amounts of terrible things that happen to you constantly, and you just kind of cope with this thought that like things are going to be different, or I'm going to fix things, or I'm going to like do this, and like you're not in a position to actually do anything, and it's not because of any fault of your own. It's entirely because of everyone around you, because it is not unreasonable for someone like Calvin to have friends, and yet you never see a single one. Like, it's like, it shouldn't be like some unfathomable, like unobtainable thing of having friends, but no, he just walks around in the woods all by himself with a stuffed tiger because nobody cares. His parents don't care. They don't seem to work because they're always at home. Like, it's just like being around that many people who are completely apathetic to how, like, lonely and miserable you are is, like, unbelievably depressing. And they always want to blame you. They always want to blame you for your behavior, for you not being taught properly, for them not taking initiative and, like, caring about you and being there for you. Like, oh, you're just a troublemaker. You're just like that. It's downright disgusting in that regard how these people act and how they disrespect Calvin, who is just a kid who has done nothing wrong in his entire life other than being a kid. It's really sad. It's depressing. But at the same time, like, you actually see it, like, the fun, like, imaginative side of it. You get, like, Calvin, like, getting jumped on by Hobbes. You get, like, all these arguments. You get, like, all these funny situations. And it never really gets old. Every time I go back to the series, I just feel this sense of this being one of the all-time greats. Like, I haven't read all of Peanuts. Like, actually, I don't even think I got past the first couple of years of it because, like, that ran for 50 years. But, like, I can't imagine that Peanuts is better than this. I don't know if there's any newspaper strip that, like, manages to maintain this level of quality throughout and stay interesting, engaging, funny, fresh, and original. Like, I do feel like Calvin and Hobbes is probably the gold standard for, ending a series before it got too stale. Because, like, I think, like, there isn't really any low points in the franchise's history. I don't think there are any bad arcs or strips or anything. Like, every time I come back to it, I'm just blown away by the quality of it all. And like, there is this feeling that, like, maybe he could have done, like, another 10 years, or maybe there could be more. But, like, honestly, I think 10 years of this level of quality is more than enough, honestly. I'm very happy that that I've discovered this series, and I really hope I get to share it with other people someday. I suppose this is the first time ever I've talked about at length about how I feel about this, and yeah, it's really exciting being in the position where I can talk about how much I love Calvin and Hobbes.